Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Define a Vendor Risk Management Process Lifecycle. My name is Doug Bennett, and I am Director of Marketing at Lynx Technology Partners. Lynx is the sponsor of today's presentation. As most of you know, today's webinar is part 2 of our 3-part series on vendor risk management. We hope you were all able to join us last week for part 1, Developing a Strategy. No worries if not. You may download the slides during this presentation, and we will also provide a link to the recording and a follow-up email after today's event. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see your attendee interface on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation or via email after the event. The How to Define a Vendor Risk Management Process Lifecycle is available for download in the handout pane of your control panel. You may download anytime during the presentation. And as I mentioned, today's event is part 2 of a 3-part series on vendor risk management. Details will be included at the end of the presentation and in your follow-up email on how you can register for part 3 next Tuesday, February 21st, or listen to a recording of part 1 in case you missed it. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I would just like to say that Lynx Technology Partners is honored and excited to sponsor this series. In case you weren't with us last week, just a quick introduction to Lynx. We are one of Inc. magazine's fastest growing private companies and ranked among the top U.S. security companies for consecutive years. Lynx Technology Partners is an information security and risk management advisor that customers in highly regulated industries worldwide depend on to improve security posture, facilitate compliance, reduce risk, and refine operational efficiency. Lynx security experts help customers recognize and control IT-related risk and maintain compliance with major industry and government standards. Through consulting, security, and risk assessments, penetration testing, managed security services, and an award-winning GRC solution, we support many critical projects for security-conscious leaders in financial services, federal, energy, healthcare, state government, and higher education. With that said, I would now like to introduce Michael Rasmussen, the GRC pundit at GRC 2020 Research. Michael?
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. And what I feel is one of the most, important topics that organizations have to face, and that's how do we deal with third-party relationships, particularly vendors, and in that context, information security risk. Now, today's organizations are porous. We have a myriad of different types of third-party relationships. We have vendors, suppliers, contractors, outsourcers, service providers, brokers, dealers, agents, intermediaries, you name it. You go back, 10, 20 years ago, and the term insider was pretty much a synonym for an employee. Now, half of our insiders are not employees. They are third parties. And how do we deal with that? And there's a range of risks that bear down upon us. Now, today we're going to be focused a lot on the information security risks in third-party relationships. And there's been a lot of significant issues there. A lot of the major data breaches and things that we've seen in the news and have had, personal experience of in some instances, as far as credit card theft, those have often come from third parties of major organizations that have caused those breaches. But there's a wide range of other risks too. Human rights, bribery and corruption, health and safety. There's a variety of things, international labor standards across the different third-party relationships. But today we're focusing on, more particularly the information security aspects of vendor risk management. And so that's sort of what we're looking at today. Now, let's start off with a definition. A couple of these slides are repeats from the previous webinar, but I want to make sure that we have some continuity and build some synergies between these three educational webinars. Now, if we take the definition of GRC, Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance, and adapt it to third-party vendor management, first off, the definition of GRC is that GRC is an integrated capability to reliably achieve objectives, that's the governance function, while addressing uncertainty, that's risk management. In fact, ISO 31000, the risk management standard, states that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and act with integrity. That's the compliance piece. Not just regulatory compliance, but compliance to our overall code of conduct, like vendor code of conduct, to our compliance to our corporate social responsibility positions and statements. And so let's adapt that GRC definition for third-party vendor management. Third-party vendor management is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty and act with integrity in and across its third-party relationships. So these third-party vendor relationships, they need to be governed properly. What's the purpose? Are we getting that purpose out of them? Are they meeting objectives and SLAs? What risk is inherent in there? Do we have risk of exposure of sensitive information and things, and breach of that information, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information? And how do we act with integrity? Make sure that we are compliant with the laws, regulations, and policies of our organization or that are upon our organization across these vendor relationships. So third-party vendor management is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve the objectives in those relationships, address uncertainty and risk in those relationships, and act with integrity and therefore be compliant in those relationships. But most organizations I encounter when it comes to vendor risk management have very manual and ad hoc processes. I was just talking to one just a couple days ago that they're managing about 300 vendors in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Now that's significant for that organization, but I've talked to some organizations that are managing like 80,000 vendors and suppliers and manual processes. And all this adds up. With document, spreadsheets, and email approaches, we don't have the staff time to be able to properly chase things down, find things that are just halfway submitted and things, and gather more information and build reports on that. I don't know if one organization has the proper staff time to manage all this in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. It's like Hercules battling the Hydra. Hercules had several battles to fight. One was against the multi-headed dragon, the Hydra, and every time Hercules would cut off one of its heads, several more heads would grow up in its place. And we need to think of better ways of doing that. Now, stay tuned. That's going to be the focus of next week's webinar on the information and technology architecture for vendor risk management. So when organizations approach vendor risk management, they approach it from a variety of perspectives. They can approach it from a specific risk or regulatory issue. Maybe you're a bank and you're trying to deal with the OCC requirements upon banks for vendor risk management that makes it a board level issue, and you're looking for a solution just to solve that problem. Maybe overall we're looking at an overall department function. I want an overall vendor risk management program for the IT department. Or we could have an enterprise strategy that looks at all of our vendors across the range of risks they have in an integrated third-party risk management program.
Michael?
Now, yes.
Sorry to interrupt 1 second. I received a couple messages that we're having trouble seeing your screens. I can hear you talking, but we're still on our intro screen. Can you check your slides?
Sure. Just 1 second here. So I'm still the presenter. Do you see my screen?
We have waiting to view Michael's screen. It's not actually viewing it.
I'm not sure why it's doing that. Maybe you want to take the controls back and give them back to me. Okay.
There we go.
So, now just to recap here, we were back here at the title slide, and then looked at the variety of different third-party relationships, looked at the definition of third-party vendor management, and how many organizations are trying to manage third-party vendors' risk in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, and it's a recipe for disaster, what I call the inevitability of failure. And there's different types of approaches for vendor risk management. And then here's where I was. So thank you. Sorry about that. And hopefully the slides are working now. So organizations can have different approaches for vendor management. They could have different distributed vendor and third-party management, where there's disconnected silos and people doing things in different ways in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And this can even happen within a department like information security. One group might be looking at HIPAA, requirements and things in third-party relationships. Others might be looking at PCI DSS requirements, and trying to manage things ad hoc, and just very manual. Or we can federate and provide an integrated third-party management, vendor management program that brings things together. So my challenge here to organizations is, you've been working on third-party vendor management of some sort for the last, decade or two. We've had vendor and supplier relationships for quite some time now. And a lot of times it reminds me of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. If you've ever been there, it's a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s. And it cost $5.5 million to build in the 1800s. It's one expensive house today. It took 38 years to build, but it had no design, no blueprint, or no architect. But it had 147 different builders. So at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense. It's got doorways that open to walls. It's got stairways that go up or down to nowhere, and skylights that are in floors instead of ceilings. This is a lot of our vendor risk management programs in the organization, that over the last decade or two, we've been trying to manage things in ad hoc processes of documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Instead of 147 different builders, we've had 147 different cooks in the fire, in the fire, doing vendor risk management in different ways. And let's step back and say, if we could design vendor risk management, what would it look like? What would the process look like? How would we structure that? So let's get into that today. Now, overall, the course of what we're looking at in this webinar series is how to develop a vendor risk management strategy, and that was the previous webcast that we did. Today, we're going to look at some of the vendor risk management processes, and then next week, we're going to look at how information and technology architecture supports the process and strategy. But some core components of a vendor risk management plan. First off is establish your goals. What are you trying to achieve? Now, from a vendor risk management perspective, for most of us on the phone, that's going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be around information security, and in that context, also privacy. To be able to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information that third parties either store or have access to. and that access can be very vague as well. You look at the Target breach from a couple of years ago. Target, when we talk about access there in that breach, it's like network access, not just access to information. Because a HVAC vendor, heating and air conditioning vendor, had a legitimate connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. The HVAC vendor was compromised by a hacker. The hacker then got into the Target network and compromised point-of-sale systems and stole millions of credit card numbers. But the point here is, what is our goals? Well, what are we trying to achieve? And obviously, that's the information, security, privacy, and in that context, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Who is our audience? What type of third parties do we have? How do we rank and score third parties? There's going to be a different risk exposure to information security between, a major IT outsourcer that we have a vendor relationship with and somebody that comes in to water the plants. And so we need to be able to understand who is our audience and what's the range of risks on that audience. What resources are needed to be able to manage this program? What type of staff do we need? What type of technology do we need? How do we communicate things? The accessibility aspect. Now, when we manage vendor relationships, not all the time are we dealing with English as the primary language, as particularly for a global organization. Do we support our vendor code of conduct and things in different languages? And in that context, when we do vendor risk assessments and send out questionnaires and surveys, do we support different languages? How do we make things accessible? And how do we provide accessibility to a portal on vendor risks and for the vendors to be able to answer questions? How do we measure the program? What are the metrics that need to be put in place? How do we align our different third-party vendor risk programs? So how do we take information security and make sure that's covered in a vendor code of conduct that covers other things like international labor standards and things? What are the internal stakeholders that need to be involved? And what executives are supporting the program and they expect to see reports on this and dashboards? So an overview of a vendor risk management process starts with registration. That's getting that initial information on a vendor, and this is even before we determine that we're going to have this vendor relationship that's going to be approved. We need basic information where the vendor registers and submits some basic information where we can then qualify them. Are they a capable vendor that's going to properly protect information, as well as other qualifications like bribery and corruption and looking at politically exposed person lists and everything else. But we need to qualify that vendor third-party relationships and give it some type of yes or no that it is an appropriate relationship to move forward with. And then we move into the contracting phase where we contract with that third party to be able to make sure that the proper contracts are in place and that there's proper provisions like right to audit clauses and things. And from there we move in, once that contract is signed and we have a relationship in place, we move into the onboarding phase. And the onboarding phase is where we register the third parties they take like the vendor code of conduct, they sign off and attest to it, they might answer surveys and questionnaires, risk assessments and things. And then we move into a cycle of maintenance and renewal. But throughout that maintenance and renewal phases, we manage risk and compliance, manage performance of the relationship. We provide audits and inspections, so we exercise right to audit clauses. One company that I worked with, tiered every vendor on a red, yellow, green level. Now, this is a Fortune 100 company. And red level vendors were audited every year, while yellow level vendors were medium risk and audited every other year. Green level vendors were randomly sampled for auditing. It wasn't a regular process. And then how do we manage issues and resolutions as they occur in the relationship, such as a data breach? And how do we offboard or retire the relationship? Some foundational components of a vendor risk management program is going to be able to understand what the risk and exposure is, like information and privacy risk that's up there in one of the red flags, as well as regulatory compliance and others, but also understand this in context of the value the relationship's bringing. What are we getting out of this relationship, and are we achieving that? And there's four fundamental building blocks I want to go through in the next couple slides to discuss on how do we build a vendor risk management program. Even before we get into some more of the process life cycle and things, what are some of the building blocks? First one is identify. Again, we want to be able to identify the different types of third-party relationships and be able to risk score them and rank them on their exposure around information security and privacy and other third-party risks. We need to be able to map the internal relationship, who owns these relationships, and provide relevant triggers for alerts or changes and risk exposures. So this means that we identify roles and responsibilities, we provide training and support to those internal relationships so they understand how to request third parties to register, vendors to register, and what type of information security assessments and things and information that needs to be gathered on that, and to provide a structured level of accountability across the organization. From there, the next building block is the ability to monitor. Here we want to be able to monitor the contracts and contact information for all third-party relationships, map those internal relationships again, understand what those contract requirements and compliance is so that we can monitor those on an ongoing basis, and look for changes to risks and regulations and obligations as well as the business and changes in the third-party relationship that might impact the organization. So here we need to make sure that we have some fundamental pieces to be able to establish risk ranking and mapping and being able to provide some type of alerts all around key risk indicators when there's something that's not right with the third-party vendor relationship, be able to monitor things on an ongoing basis, monitor the specific actions and controls that are put in place in vendor relationships, define triggers when things are going awry and we need to be able to fix them, and establish some way to report issues and resolve them because when monitoring triggers something. The next core component is the assess piece. Here we want to assess risk and compliance on an ongoing basis. We want to compare this and contrast this against service level agreements and key performance indicators in the relationship. We want to identify internal, external events and triggers and changes and measure the overall effectiveness of a third-party relationship third-party program, vendor risk management program. So this involves profiling our risks and being able to look at each type of risk across my third-party vendor relationships and see where there's maybe too much cumulative aggregated risk and exposure to the organization. Provide profile links where you can look at each party involved across all the different vendor relationships to assess the real risk information. And prioritize risks and parties and be able to set priorities and assign them to appropriate personnel for resolution, and provide ongoing assurance that things are being done correctly in addressing risk and compliance in vendor relationships. The fourth building block component is the reevaluate. We don't just come into a third-party vendor relationship once and do some type of assessment during onboarding. That's old school. That's what we used to do. Now we need to continually reevaluate. We need to look at these relationships on an ongoing, continuous basis, such as annual, or you could do like the one company I mentioned. Would do things on a red, yellow, green level, and red level high-risk vendors were annual, while low-risk vendors were semi-annual, and green level vendors were randomly sampled and things. We need to reevaluate the overall program for vendor risk management as well as the individual relationships themselves to ensure that the right controls are in place and that there's some type of continuous evolving evaluation of risks and exposure in the organization for across vendor risk management. Okay, now, if you followed along so far, we looked at some of the why vendor risk management is important, and from that standpoint, we moved into this three-part series in which we looked at, and discussed that last week we looked at the vendor risk management strategy. This week we're looking at process lifecycle, and next week we're looking at the information technology architecture, and then some of the building blocks that need to be put in place. Now let's look at the life cycle again. Now I did have one slide that we went through that life cycle, but let's look at it from a different perspective. We need an integrated vendor risk management process that's supported by a unified technology architecture to make sure that things are consistent, effective, that communication documentation is done, and things are, again, efficient and effective and agile for the organization. So the very first step that you want to do in building this strategy and process is plan and organize. You want to develop a plan to assess the level of complexity of inherent risk presented in each activity, in each relationship and segment. Some things to consider is the volume and nature of activity, such as type of information that a third-party vendor relationship is accessing, the nature of the risks. Is that third party using subcontractors? And how are we assuring that those subcontractors aren't introducing risk that's unwanted? Providing for customer interactions, ensuring that the information security controls are in place and regulatory requirements are being met, that there's business continuity and disaster recovery plans, and that everything's properly approved on setting up vendor relationships. From there, we need to perform due diligence. Now, due diligence is performed in the onboarding stage of a vendor to make sure that they have the right information security controls, as well as that they're a reputable organization and they don't have like criminals and things working for them, or have somebody that's susceptible to bribery and corruption, other things. And so we do a range of due diligence checks during onboarding, but we also need continual due diligence that we're looking at this type of information on a regular basis. And this might include self-disclosure surveys that could go out to vendors, that they have to answer surveys and questions on an annual basis and provide documentation of the information security of their systems, and be able to evaluate them on compliance and risk, their financial condition, their experience and reputation, the company principles, background checks, the information security and systems and accreditation of those systems, managing of incidents, and how they manage human resources and conflicts of interest. The third aspect that we want to make sure that we look at in a vendor risk management process is the contract terms. We need to make sure that we understand what the key performance indicators as well as risk indicators to those performance, and that they're monitored and managed, and that we're providing good information management reporting on vendor relationships and risks, and have audit and oversight rights, that there's like right to audit clauses established in contracts, and we're exercising those when and where appropriate. That compliance requirements are specifically spelled out and the vendor understands those and is meeting those, and to clearly spell out the use of information and intellectual property and technology, as well as confidentiality, integrity, conflicts of interest. If subcontracting subcontractors are allowed, and what's the requirements if they are, termination and other covenants. But we need to be able to manage the contracts from the ongoing negotiation to the renegotiations to the offboarding of the organization. And from there, we conduct ongoing monitoring. Excuse me. The ongoing monitoring aspect is the ability to oversee and proactively monitor and review each third-party relationship at a level commensurate with risk to assess the ability to meet service level agreements, performance metrics, duties and responsibilities, and other contractual terms. You also want to be able to monitor the compliance with legal and regulatory requirements and ensure that issues are identified and appropriately escalated and remediated. And so we need ongoing monitoring of the relationship because the relationships evolve and change over time, and we need to make sure that we're keeping up with that. And step 5 is managing terminations. And this is another area where I find that a lot of organizations end up failing. They might onboard things in relationships properly, but it's the offboarding. And the offboarding is critical. It doesn't matter if the relationship is being terminated for a negative cause or it's just no longer needed. But you need to follow an established plan for transitioning the third-party relationship, the vendor relationship, and what type of information that needs to be protected in that transition period to maintain smooth operations and protect the organization. So you need to implement an established transition plan, manage disposition of information, intellectual property, and other technology and company assets. Discontinue, monitor all access points and connectivity to networks, and evaluate need to address reputation risk if needed, if the relationship is being terminated for some type of negative issue. The other thing that needs to be understood is being able to manage independent assessment, so exercising right to audit clauses. Now, you might use internal auditors to exercise right to audit clauses to go out and look at vendor relationships. You might use external auditors or some type of consulting firm and things to go out and provide those relationships. But you need to be able to go out and take the vendor relationships you have and understand when and how, what are the triggers. It might be on some cycle, like that red, yellow, green level I mentioned. It might be on some other cycle or approach for your organization. But you should have some defined methodology for when right to audit clauses are triggered and you go out and investigate the organization. Now, maturing vendor risk management delivers contextual intelligence to the organization. So when we take this strategy and process life cycle, we should become more aware of vendor risk management in the organization and how it is how vendor risk impacts other enterprise and operational risks, how it impacts objectives and performance, and that we can become more aware. That helps us become more aligned. Where is our vendor risk exposure the greatest, and where can we address those resources to address that? This enables us to become more responsive. When there are issues, how do we respond to those and contain those issues? Which allows us to be agile, and that we can be very adaptive and agile in a very dynamic business environment. Your regulatory environment's changing rapidly, your risk environment's changing, your business environment's changing. But your third-party vendor relationships, their environments are changing too. You need agility to keep up with all the change in those relationships, which makes things more resilient and then also lean, efficient on how we use resources, particularly when we look at next week the information technology architecture. For those of you on the phone that are looking at third-party vendor management type solutions, I do offer complimentary inquiries where I listen to what your needs are and can ask your questions about the types of solutions that are available in the market, because my job is to cover the different types of solutions in the market as an analyst. And I also get involved in RFP development support for vendor risk management and other GRC areas. As was already noted by Doug, we do have last week's recording that's available out there at the URL that's provided in this slide. And don't forget to register for next week's Vendor Risk Management Part 3, where we look at the information technology architecture to support vendor risk management. So with that, I'd like to turn that back over to our host for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, How to Define a Vendor Risk Management Process Lifecycle. We're going to follow up with questions via email after, just a couple that came in other than our little technical difficulties in making sure that we got the slides. So we would definitely follow up later today with those. I would just like to thank Michael again, and hopefully we will see everyone again next week for our third and final installment of the series. If you do have any other questions, please contact me at dyarabinetz@linksTP.com. or you can visit linksgrc.com, our website. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. And once again, on behalf of Links Technology Partners and our presenter, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.